There are monsters that don't hide under the bed. They sit at the dinner table, say grace before meals, and call themselves family. The story I'm telling today is certainly one of the heaviest you'll ever hear. My name is Eleanor Rose Thompson, now 78 years old, with over half a century of silence weighing on my shoulders. I was born and lived my entire life in rural Georgia, in a small town where the summer heat presses down like a heavy blanket, and family secrets are guarded even more closely than property lines. Many around here know me only as Grandma Ellie, the white-haired lady who sells homemade pies at the Saturday farmers market and never misses 6 o'clock church. Few can imagine what I've carried inside me since I was 10 years old. Sharing this affects me deeply, so I'd appreciate if you'd like the video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. I also want to connect with you in the comments, so please share where you're watching this video from. I feel it's time to tell my story. Not for me, I've learned to carry this weight, but for all the children who, like me, had their childhood stolen by hands that should have protected them. Perhaps, hearing my account, someone will find the courage to act before silence becomes a lifelong prison. My childhood home was a simple wooden house, painted light blue, with a small porch where my mother placed pots of red geraniums. We were a modest family, like most in our area. My father, Ernest, worked hard in the cotton fields, leaving before sunrise and returning when stars already adorned the sky. My mother, Caroline, besides caring for the house and children, baked bread and pies to sell to neighbors. I was the oldest of 3 siblings. After me came Paul, 2 years younger, and little Rosie, who had barely turned 5. Our life was simple, marked by hard work and small pleasures. The smell of bread coming out of the oven in the afternoon, the stories my mother told before bedtime, swimming in the creek on hot summer days. We were poor, but happy in our own way, until tragedy knocked on our door on that fateful May 12th, 1957. The day began gray, with a fine, constant rain that gave no respite. I woke up earlier than usual to the sound of my mother's cough coming from the next room. It wasn't an ordinary cough. It was deep, harsh, as if something was tearing inside her. When I entered my parents' room, I saw Mom lying down, her face red with fever, her lips with a strange coloration that I didn't recognize at the time, but now know was cyanosis. "Mom, is everything okay?" I asked, frightened by the sight of her in that state. She tried to smile, but the effort seemed to cost her a lot. "Just a bad case of the flu, my flower. It'll pass soon." But it didn't pass. Throughout the morning, her condition rapidly worsened. The fever rose. Breathing became more difficult. My father, who would normally be in the fields at that hour, hadn't gone out due to the heavy rain. When he saw her condition, his face hardened with concern. "I'm taking Caroline to the hospital in Fairview," he said, referring to the neighboring town, larger than ours, where there was a small hospital. "Ellie, you're in charge of the little ones until I get back." At that time, my paternal grandfather, August Thompson, was living with us. He had come to our house after the death of my grandmother, about 8 months earlier. He was a tall man with broad shoulders even at 68, with hands calloused from decades working as a foreman on farms in the region. He had a well-trimmed gray mustache and eyes that always seemed to evaluate everything around him with a calculating coldness. "I'll keep an eye on the little ones, Ernest," my grandfather said, placing his hand on my father's shoulder. "Take Caroline and don't worry about anything here." My father nodded, grateful. He wrapped my mother in blankets and carried her to the truck we used to go to town. The last image I have of her is of her pale face contrasting with the dark blankets, her eyes meeting mine one last time as Dad took her outside under the relentless rain. "Take care of your siblings, Ellie. I'll be back soon," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible, words that would become an impossible promise to keep. The day dragged on slowly. I tried to maintain a normal routine for my siblings, preparing a simple lunch as my mother had taught me and inventing games to distract them. My grandfather remained on the porch most of the time, smoking his pipe and watching the rain that showed no signs of letting up. Occasionally, he would come in to check if we were okay, but soon returned to his silent vigil. As the day darkened, my concern grew. Where was Dad? Why weren't they coming back? Had the rain worsened the roads, making the journey slower? Around 7 in the evening, I put my siblings to bed. "Paul, understanding that something serious was happening, took a long time to fall asleep. Rosie, too young to understand, fell asleep quickly after I told her one of the stories that Mom used to tell. It was almost 9 o'clock when I heard the sound of wheels in the mud of our yard. I ran to the window, my heart racing with the hope of seeing my mother returning home. But it was just my father, alone, soaked by the rain that now fell with full force. When he came in, I immediately knew that something terrible had happened. His eyes were red and swollen, his normally upright body now bent like that of a much older man. He took off his wet hat and held it against his chest, as if he were standing before a coffin. "Where's Mom?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from his devastated look. "Your mother," he began. But his voice failed. He swallowed hard before continuing. "Caroline didn't make it, daughter. It was pneumonia, very advanced. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do." The world seemed to collapse around me. How could it be? Mom was there just that morning, trying to smile despite the fever. How could she be gone forever in just one day? My father hugged me tightly, his wet clothes soaking my dress, but I hardly noticed. We stayed like that for a long time, sharing a pain that words couldn't express. My grandfather watched from the kitchen door, his face impassive as always. "The arrangements for the wake are already being made," my father finally said, pulling away a bit. "Tomorrow morning I'll bring her home. I'll need you to be strong, Ellie. For the little ones." I nodded, swallowing the tears. I had always been the responsible daughter, the one who helped Mom with everything. Now I needed to be even more so. "Go rest, son," my grandfather said to my father. "The journey was long and tomorrow will be a difficult day. I'll keep an eye on the little ones with Ellie." My father looked at me, hesitant, but fatigue was evident in every line of his face. "Try to get some sleep, daughter. I know it's hard, but you'll need strength." I agreed again, though I knew sleep would be impossible that night. Dad went to the bedroom, the one he had shared with Mom until just a few hours before. The muffled sound of his crying crossed the thin walls of our house for hours. I sat in the living room, at the table, staring at nothing. The rain continued outside, as if the sky itself was crying for my mother. My grandfather sat on the other side of the table, pouring himself a shot of whiskey we kept for visitors. "Take a sip," he said, extending the glass to me. "It helps numb the pain." I hesitated. I had never drunk alcohol in my life, and I knew Mom wouldn't approve. But Mom wasn't there anymore, and the pain in my chest felt like it was going to swallow me whole. I accepted the glass and took a small sip. The drink burned my throat, making my eyes water even more. I took another sip. Bigger this time. "That's right," my grandfather murmured, refilling the glass when I finished. "Life is hard, Eleanor. Better to learn that early." I don't know how many drinks I had that night. I only know that the world began to get blurry, my thoughts confused. At some point, my grandfather got up from his chair and came to my side. "Come, I'll help you lie down," he said, his voice strangely soft as he helped me up. But he didn't take me to the room I shared with Rosie. Instead, he led me to his own room, in the back of the house. In my confusion and sadness, I didn't question it. Maybe I thought it was better not to disturb my little sister with my crying. What happened next remained buried in the darkest place of my memory for many years. Fragments only. Rough hands where they shouldn't be. Sharp pain, ignored pleas. The weight of a large body on mine, too small to resist. The smell of whiskey and pipe tobacco mixed with hot breath on my face. Whispered words that still haunt me in nightmares. "Now you're the woman of the house." At some point, I must have lost consciousness, because my next clear memory is of dawn. I was back in my own room, lying next to Rosie, who slept peacefully, ignorant of the new reality that surrounded us. For a moment, I thought that everything, Mom's illness, her death, what happened afterward, had just been a cruel nightmare. Then I felt the physical pain, saw the marks on my arms, noticed the bloodstain on the sheet. It hadn't been a nightmare. It was real, everything was real, and my mother really was dead. And on the same day I lost her, I also lost my innocence, my childhood, my trust in the world. In that moment, something inside me closed off. An iron gate descended over my emotions, locking everything inside. I got up carefully so as not to wake Rosie, changed clothes, washed my face in the basin of water we kept in the room. I looked at myself in the small mirror on the wall and saw a different person, still with the face of a 10-year-old girl, but with eyes that had aged decades in a single night. I went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast as Mom used to do. It was the day of her wake, and I knew the house would soon be full of neighbors and relatives. Normalcy was my only refuge, the only thing that kept me from completely falling apart. My father was already up, his eyes swollen, his face marked by a night of tears. He hugged me again, and I needed all my newly discovered strength not to break down in his embrace, not to scream the truth about what had happened. "I'm going to get your mother now," he said, his voice hoarse. "Take care of the little ones when they wake up." I nodded mechanically. Take care of the little ones. That's what I would do from that day on. Take care of the little ones and keep silent. Because who would believe me? Who would stand against the word of a respected man like my grandfather? And how could I bring more pain to my father, who had just lost the love of his life? So began my long winter of silence, the day I lost my mother and much more. The day I learned in the cruelest way that the world is not a safe place, especially for a girl. The day I learned that sometimes monsters have our own blood. And I stayed silent for so long that I almost forgot what it was like to have a voice, until something happened that changed everything. But that's a story for our next meeting. The days that followed my mother's burial passed like a dense fog over the fields in a Georgia winter. The wake was a blur of familiar faces, hugs that couldn't warm me, and words of comfort that didn't reach my ears. I only remember the simple light wood coffin, my mother's face, too serene, as if she were a wax doll, not the vibrant woman who hummed while kneading bread, and how I firmly held my siblings' hands the whole time. Paul, at 8 years old, understood enough to cry nonstop. Rosie, too young to understand the finality, repeatedly asked when Mom would wake up. Each question was like a knife twisting in my chest. In our small community, grief had its own rituals. The women took over the kitchen, filling our pantry with food that would last for weeks. Homemade breads, pies, preserves, sausages, cheeses. The men took turns helping my father in the field work, knowing he wouldn't be able to handle everything alone in the first few weeks. Solidarity was the only tangible comfort in those days. But the visits gradually decreased. Life has its own urgency, and people returned to their routines. A week after the burial, we were again just us, a father devastated by loss, 3 motherless children, and a grandfather whose eyes now followed me around the house like a predator stalking. My father, consumed by his own grief, barely noticed what was happening around him. He left before dawn and returned at dusk, falling exhausted into bed with no energy for anything else. I think work was his only escape, the only way to endure my mother's absence. Perhaps he believed that if he tired himself enough, he wouldn't dream of her at night. "You're being a good girl, Ellie," he would sometimes say, passing his hand over my hair. "Your mother would be proud." Those words should have comforted, but they caused me deep pain. If he knew what happened when he was absent, would he still look at me with that pride in his eyes? I assumed the responsibilities of the house as best I could. I woke up early to prepare breakfast, helped my siblings get dressed for the rural school that was 2 miles from home, washed clothes in the stone tank, cooked what I had learned from Mom. My small hands tried to recreate her gestures, but everything came out different. The beans never had the same taste, the bread didn't rise the same way, the clothes weren't as white. Each failure was a painful reminder of her absence. At night, when everyone was asleep, I cried silently into my pillow, muffling the sobs so as not to wake Rosie who slept beside me. I cried for Mom, for myself, for the weight of responsibilities too big for such small shoulders. But mostly, I cried for the terror that grew in my chest every time I was alone with my grandfather. After that first night, he became more careful, more methodical. He waited for moments when my father went out to resolve some issue in town, when my siblings were at school or playing with the neighbors. There was always an excuse to call me to his room, to the tool shed, or even to the bank of the creek that crossed our property. "Come help me here, Eleanor," he would say, with his rough voice that allowed no refusal. And I would go, my body trembling, knowing what awaited me, but unable to escape. What choice did a 10-year-old girl have in a time when children had no voice, when the word of an adult, especially a respected man in the community, was unquestionable law? He always used the same words afterward. "This stays between us. Your father already has enough problems. You don't want to cause him more suffering, do you?" And so he silenced me, using my love for my father as a weapon against me. It was a cruel game of manipulation that I, in my innocence, had no way to combat. I truly believed that telling the truth would kill my father with grief, that it would be my fault if our family, already fragile from the loss of Mom, completely disintegrated. The months dragged on in this continuous nightmare. Winter came with full force to the south, bringing frosts that whitened the fields in the morning, and nights so cold we could see our breath inside the house. On the days when the wind was strongest, cutting through to the bone, I almost appreciated the cold that allowed me to wear several layers of clothing, creating one more barrier between me and the hands that violated me. Over time, I learned to mentally absent myself during those moments. While my body was trapped there, my mind escaped far away, to the stories Mom used to tell, to the green fields where we used to pick flowers in spring, to a distant future where I would be big enough to run away from there with my siblings. It was a form of survival, a dissociation that allowed me to endure the unbearable. In August of that year, when I turned 11, I realized with horror that my body was beginning to change. Small, painful buds appeared on my chest, announcing an early puberty that only worsened my situation. My grandfather noticed these changes with an interest that filled me with nausea. "Turning into a young lady, huh?" he commented one day, his eyes traversing my body in a way that made me want to disappear. "Your mother developed early too." I tried to hide the changes as best I could. I wore loose clothes, hunched my shoulders, tight bands under my shirts, anything to look smaller, less visible, less desirable to his eyes. But it was useless. That summer, we began to receive frequent visits from a distant cousin of my father, Aunt Louise, a widow in her 50s who lived in town. She came on Sundays, brought cakes and sweets for us, and observed our situation with attentive eyes that seemed to see more than others. "This girl is too thin," she commented to my father once. "And those eyes, they look like they belong to someone much older." It was the first time anyone had noticed something. I felt a mix of hope and panic. Part of me wanted her to discover everything, to take that heavy secret away from me. Another part trembled with fear of the consequences, of the possibility of not being believed, of causing a storm in the family. My grandfather perceived the danger that Aunt Louise represented. He became more cautious when she was around, treating me with a calculated distance that could pass for respect. But his eyes sent clear messages. No one would believe me. I had no choice but to remain silent. As time passed, I developed small acts of resistance. Small rebellions that probably went unnoticed by others, but which for me represented important battles in the silent war I was waging. I began to sleep with scissors under my pillow. I began to wake up before everyone to lock the doors of the room I shared with Rosie. I invented illnesses when I would be alone with him. But my greatest weapon was silence. Not the silence of the victim, but that of the observer. I learned to read the signs, to predict his movements, to anticipate his moods. I knew when it would be safer to be near other people, when it was better to hide in the hayloft of the barn, a hiding place I discovered by chance and that he never found, when his mood was particularly dangerous. In March of 1958, almost a year after my mother's death, something happened that would change the course of our family history forever. It was a Saturday, I remember clearly. My father had gone to town to sell some products from our small garden and buy supplies. Paul and Rosie were at the neighbor's house, attending a birthday party. I was alone at home with my grandfather, cleaning the wood stove, when he appeared at the kitchen door. "Come here, Eleanor," he ordered, with that tone that didn't allow refusals. My heart raced. I knew that tone, that look well. But that day, something inside me rebelled. Maybe it was the wear of almost a year living in that hell. Maybe it was the memory of my mother that seemed particularly vivid that morning. Maybe it was simply that my cup of tolerance had overflowed. "I can't right now," I answered, without looking at him, continuing to scrub the ashes from the stove with more force than necessary. "I need to finish this before Dad gets back." He seemed stunned for a moment, I had never directly disobeyed before, but surprise soon gave way to anger. He crossed the kitchen in 3 wide steps, grabbed my arm with enough force to leave marks, and began to drag me toward his room. "Who do you think you are to answer me like that?" he growled through his teeth. "Forgot who's in charge here while your father's away?" I fought, trying to break free, scratching, kicking. It was useless against his adult man's strength, but I continued resisting anyway. Something had broken inside me. If it was going to happen anyway, at least I wouldn't be submissive this time. That's when we heard the sound of wheels in the yard. My grandfather froze, still holding my arm with brutal force. We weren't expecting anyone at that hour. He abruptly released me, pushing me against the stove. "Go see who it is, and not a word about this, understood?" I ran to the window, my heart pounding. It was my father's truck, returning earlier than expected. Never had the faded red of that old truck looked so beautiful to my eyes. My grandfather quickly disappeared to his room, and I tried to compose myself before my father entered. Smoothing my apron, fixing my hair, breathing deeply to contain the tears that threatened to fall. My father came in, bringing a bag of supplies and a small package wrapped in brown paper that I later discovered was a piece of fabric for me to make a new dress. His face, normally marked by sadness since Mom's death, seemed a little lighter that day. "I came back early," he explained, placing the groceries on the table. "The storm is coming. I thought it better not to risk getting stuck on the road." Indeed, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, heralding one of those summer storms that transform dirt roads into impassable mud pits. I helped him store the groceries, trying to act normally, but my arm throbbed where my grandfather had squeezed it, and my heart still beat erratically from the interrupted confrontation. My father observed me carefully as we organized everything. At one point, his hand touched my arm exactly at the spot of the red marks left by my grandfather's fingers. I instinctively recoiled with a moan of pain that I couldn't contain. "What is that on your arm, Ellie?" he asked, furrowing his brow. "Nothing," I answered quickly. "I hid it when I was cleaning under the table." He didn't seem convinced. His eyes, so similar to mine, the same ones I had seen so many times in the mirror age prematurely, studied my face for a long moment. "Is something happening that I should know about?" he finally asked, his voice soft but firm. The words got stuck in my throat. It was my chance to tell everything, to end that nightmare. But fear, of disbelief, of the consequences, of the possibility of destroying what remained of our family, paralyzed me. "No, Dad," I lied, lowering my eyes so he wouldn't see the truth in them. "Everything's fine." He sighed, seeming not at all convinced, but didn't insist. Instead, he briefly caressed my hair before going to see where my grandfather was. The first thunders began to sound in the distance, announcing the imminent storm. Inside me, another storm was forming, one made of guilt for not having taken advantage of that opportunity, of relief for having escaped that time, and of a new feeling that I took time to recognize. Hope. My father had noticed something. He had asked questions. Maybe, just maybe, not all was lost. What I didn't know at that moment was that the real storm in our family was just beginning to form on the horizon, about to break with a force that would change our lives forever. The storm that was forming that March afternoon of 1958 wasn't just the one darkening the horizon. There was another, denser and more charged, forming within the walls of our house. The days that followed the incident in the kitchen were filled with an almost palpable tension. My grandfather, for the first time, seemed cautious around me, casting glances that mixed threat and apprehension. My father, in turn, observed us with renewed attention, as if he had awakened from a long trance of mourning. Something had changed in my father's behavior. He began to arrive earlier from work in the fields, to ask questions about our day, to notice small details that before went unnoticed in his fog of pain. Sometimes I caught him observing me with a questioning expression, as if trying to decipher an enigma written on my face. Other times, I caught him in whispered discussions with my grandfather, conversations that abruptly ceased when I entered the room. The house routine followed its apparent course. I continued taking care of the house and my siblings, cooking, washing, sewing. But something subtle had changed in the family dynamic. The opportunities my grandfather found to be alone with me drastically decreased, not for lack of attempts on his part, but because my father seemed to always be nearby at critical moments, appearing unexpectedly when least expected. On a particularly cold April night, when autumn was already painting the leaves of the trees red and gold, what I secretly feared and hoped for happened. My siblings were already asleep, and I was finishing washing the dinner dishes. The kitchen was illuminated only by the kerosene lamp hanging in the center, and by the orange glow that escaped through the door of the wood stove. The sound of crickets and the distant howl of a dog were the only noises besides the monotonous scrubbing of the cloth against the plates. My grandfather entered the kitchen stealthily, with that heavy but silent walk that I had learned to recognize and fear. My father had gone out to check a noise in the shed where we kept the tools, or at least that's what he said. In retrospect, I realize it was a carefully planned trap. Alone, Eleanor? My grandfather's voice sounded low and hoarse behind me. The familiar chill of dread ran down my spine. I nodded without turning around, my hands mechanically continuing the work of drying the dishes as if nothing was happening, as if I could hide in the normalcy of the task. It's been a while since we've had a moment just for us, he continued, approaching. I could feel his breath, a mix of tobacco and whiskey on my neck. Your father's been very clingy lately, hasn't he? His heavy hands landed on my small shoulders, and I felt my legs weaken. I already knew what would come next, the same nightmare that had been repeating for almost a year. I closed my eyes tightly, looking for that distant place in my mind where I used to take refuge. What's happening here? My father's voice, cutting like I had never heard it before, broke the silence. I opened my eyes to see him standing at the kitchen door, an expression that mixed incredulity and growing fury on his normally gentle face. My grandfather removed his hands from my shoulders as if they had been burned, taking a step back. Nothing, son, he answered with false casualness. Just talking with the girl. Talking. My father's voice was low, contained, but his eyes burned. That's not what it looked like to me. A dense silence descended over the kitchen, broken only by the crackling of the wood in the stove. I remained frozen, the half-dried plate still in my hands, unable to move or speak. I had imagined this moment, the moment when my secret would be revealed, hundreds of times, but now that it was happening, I couldn't emit a single sound. Go to your room, Ellie, my father ordered, without taking his eyes off my grandfather. I hesitated for a moment, divided between the relief of being able to escape and the fear of what would happen when I left. Go, he repeated, this time with more firmness. I dropped the plate and the dish towel and quickly passed by my father toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. But instead of going to my room, I stopped in the darkness of the hallway, my heart hammering so hard that I feared they could hear it. What were you doing with my daughter? My father's voice sounded again, now that he thought I was far away. I already told you, we were just talking, my grandfather answered. But his voice had a subtle tremor that I had never heard before. You're imagining things. Am I? My father's voice acquired a dangerous tone. For weeks I've been watching you two, the marks on her arms, the way she cringes when you come near, the nightmares at night. Do you think I'm blind or stupid? She's a clumsy girl, always hurting herself. And as for the nightmares, she lost her mother, it's normal. Don't take me for an idiot! My father's voice exploded, making me shrink in the darkness of the hallway. Last night I stayed awake, pretending to sleep. I saw you trying to enter her room. I saw you insisting even when she said she was sick. A stunned silence followed those words. So my father had seen. He had noticed. He wasn't as oblivious as I thought. A wave of relief washed over me, immediately followed by terror of what would come next. You don't understand. My grandfather's voice sounded different now, conciliatory. The girl confuses things. She needs a maternal figure, and since she doesn't have one, sometimes she misinterprets. Shut up, my father shouted, and I heard the sound of something breaking. A plate, perhaps, or a cup. Don't dare insinuate that my daughter is lying. I didn't do anything she didn't want. My grandfather's voice took on a more defiant tone. She's been provoking me for months, offering herself. She's a woman before her time, just like her mother. The sound that followed was like thunder inside the kitchen, the impact of fist against flesh. I heard a grunt of pain and the noise of furniture being dragged, objects falling. They were fighting. Never speak of my late wife or my daughter again, my father's voice roared. The sound of the fight increased. I covered my ears, terrified, but couldn't block the noise. Glass breaking, wood cracking, grunts of pain and effort. Then a particularly strong thud, followed by a sudden silence. I ran back to the kitchen door, driven by panic. The scene I found will forever be engraved in my memory. My father standing, panting, with bleeding fists. My grandfather fallen on the dirt floor, motionless, a blood stain spreading under his head where he had hit the corner of the wood stove. "Dad?" My voice came out as a whisper. My father turned to me, his face transformed by shock and the realization of what had just happened. For an instant he seemed not to recognize me, as if looking through me to some distant point. Then his gaze cleared. "Ellie," he said, his voice breaking, "I told you to go to your room. Is he—" I couldn't complete the question. My father knelt beside my grandfather, checking the pulse in his neck. After a long moment, he nodded gravely. "Go wake Paul," he ordered, assuming a practical tone that contrasted with the chaos around us. "Tell them you didn't hear anything, that you were sleeping. Understand? No matter what happens, you didn't see or hear anything." I nodded, terrified, but strangely relieved. My grandfather was dead. The nightmare was over. But another, different one, was just beginning. "And Ellie," my father added, holding my shoulders and looking directly into my eyes, "one day, when you're older, I'm going to ask you what really happened in this house. And on that day, I want you to tell me everything. But not today. Today, you saw nothing. Promise." "I promise, Dad," I answered, with a maturity beyond my years. The following hours were a confused blur. I remember waking Paul, whispering the official version to him, that we didn't hear anything, that we were sleeping, of returning to my room and hugging Rosie, who, by divine grace, slept deeply through all the chaos. I remember the sound of horses and voices in the middle of the night, of lantern lights crossing the cracks of the window, of men entering and leaving our house, of the sheriff, a burly man with a thick mustache, asking questions in a low voice, of the town doctor, examining my grandfather's body right there in the kitchen before they took him away. "It was an accident, Ernest," I heard the sheriff say to my father. "Anyone can see that the old man slipped and hit his head. Could happen to anyone, especially after a few shots of whiskey." Maybe the sheriff really believed that. Or maybe he just didn't want to get involved in problems between father and son in a small community where everyone knew each other. Either way, the official version was established. August Thompson, 69 years old, had stumbled in a state of drunkenness, hit his head on the corner of the wood stove, and died instantly. A sad domestic accident. Nobody questioned. Nobody suspected. Or if they did, they preferred to maintain silence, respecting the pain of a family already marked by the recent tragedy of my mother's loss. The wake was brief and sparsely attended. Few town residents, some former colleagues of my grandfather. No real tears were shed. My father remained stoic, fulfilling the social obligations with the dignity of a man who does what must be done, not what he wishes. I observed everything with a curious detachment, as if watching a play in which I had no part. When the simple coffin was lowered into the earth in the small community cemetery, I felt an enormous weight leave my shoulders, as if, along with that body, they were burying the last months of terror I had lived through. On the night after the burial, when we finally returned home and my siblings fell asleep, my father called me to the kitchen table, the same place where, days before, the tragedy had unfolded. The floor had been scrubbed until no trace of blood remained, but we both knew what had happened there. "Ellie," he began, his voice low so as not to wake the children, "I never asked you directly, and I won't ask now. I don't want you to carry that burden." His eyes, so similar to mine, were brimming with contained tears, the first true display of emotion I had seen in him since the incident. "I just want you to know that if I did what I did, it was because a father protects his children. Always, no matter against whom or against what." He stretched his hand across the table and held mine. It was the first time we had really talked since my mother's death. "One day, when you're ready, if you want to talk about this, I'll be here. But if you prefer to never mention the subject, that's fine too. The important thing is that now we're safe. We both did what needed to be done, I replied, surprising him and myself with the firmness in my voice. And we're alive. That's what matters. He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and admiration, as if he were really seeing me for the first time. "You're strong like your mother," he finally said, a small sad smile appearing on his tired face. She would be proud. In that moment, sitting at the kitchen table in the dim light of the lamp, something new formed between us, a silent pact, a mutual understanding that transcended words. And for the first time in almost a year, I slept without fear, without nightmares, without the shadow of the monster that lived under the same roof. What I didn't know then was that some secrets, even when buried deep, have ways of resurfacing years later, transformed by time, but no less powerful. And that, although that dark chapter had come to an end, there was still a long healing path ahead. A path that would take decades and test me in ways I could never have predicted on that night of relative relief and newly discovered peace. Life has a strange way of moving forward, even when it seems impossible. After the burial of my grandfather, our house gradually ceased to be a place of fear and became a home again. Not immediately, nor completely. Certain shadows persist for a long time, stuck to the walls like stains that no bleach can remove. The summer of 1958 arrived with its typical southern force, bringing scorching days that cracked the dry earth and sultry nights that made sleep almost impossible. However, despite the relentless heat, something inside me slowly began to thaw, as if an internal winter finally gave way to a hesitant spring. My father, although we never again directly discussed what happened on that fateful night, began to rebuild our family with a silent determination that I admire to this day. He took on not just the role of provider, but tried, in his awkward country man way, to also fill the void left by my mother. His calloused hands, accustomed to the rough work of the fields, now attempted delicate gestures, braiding Rosie's hair in the morning, checking Paul's notebooks after school, sometimes even making a simple cake on Sundays, following the yellowed recipe that my mother kept in the cookie tin. "Your father's turning into a housewife," the neighbors joked when they discovered he had learned to make bread or mend clothes. He just smiled, without embarrassment. "My children need it, so I learn," he would simply respond, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Although in 1958, in rural Georgia, it was almost revolutionary for a widower to take on such tasks. As for me, although I continued helping with household chores, my father insisted that I return to school. "Your mother wanted you to study," he would always say whenever I tried to argue that I would be more useful at home. "And I want that too." The return to the rural school, a single room where students of various ages studied together under the tutelage of Miss Martha, was both a relief and a new type of challenge. Relief to be away from home for a few hours, among people who didn't know, who would never know, what had happened between those wooden walls. Challenge because, at 11 years old, I carried experiences that irremediably separated me from the other children. "Eleanor seems to be in another world," Miss Martha would comment in meetings with my father. "She has potential, learns quickly, but always seems distant, as if part of her were somewhere else." She was right, of course. Part of me was always on guard, always vigilant. The trauma had taught me to never completely lower my guard, to always look for escape routes, to distrust easy smiles and unexplained kindnesses. At night, the nightmares continued, though less frequently. I would wake up screaming, my body covered in cold sweat, terrible images still vivid behind my eyelids. In the worst moments, it was my father who came, sat on the edge of the bed, and patiently waited until my breathing normalized. "It's all right, Ellie," he would whisper in the darkness. "It was just a bad dream. Nobody is going to hurt you. Never again." He never asked what I dreamed about. It wasn't necessary. We both knew. In early 1960, when I was 13 years old, life played another trick on us. Aunt Louise, that distant cousin of my father who sometimes visited us, was widowed from her second husband. Childless and alone in the big house in town, she proposed something that would again change the course of our lives. "Ernest," she said one Sunday after lunch while we drank sweet tea on the porch, "I've thought a lot about this. Why don't you come live with me in Fairview? The house is too big for me alone, and the children would have access to better schools. My father hesitated, running his hand over his poorly shaved chin. I don't know, Louise. This land is all I have. It was my father's and his father's before that. Nobody said anything about selling, she responded pragmatically. Hire someone to take care of it. Come on weekends. Think of the children, Ernest. What future do they have here? Eleanor is almost a young lady. She needs proper schooling if she doesn't want to end up as someone's maid. That touched my father deeply. If there was anything he ardently desired, it was for his children to have opportunities that he and my mother never had. The decision wasn't made that day, but the seed was planted. In the following months, the idea grew, was discussed countless times at the dinner table, weighing pros and cons. Paul and Rosie were excited about the prospect of living in the big city, which in reality was just a slightly larger town with approximately 5,000 inhabitants. I had mixed feelings. On one hand, the idea of leaving that house where so much suffering had occurred was tempting. On the other, despite everything, it was the only home I knew. Every corner, every tree in the yard, every stone on the path to the creek contained memories. Some painful, yes, but others precious, from happier times when Mom was still alive. In July 1960, in the middle of the harsh winter, we made the move. We didn't take much: some clothes, personal objects, the family photographs, the porcelain set that had been my mother's. The rest stayed behind, along with a part of ourselves. Aunt Louise's house in Fairview was really large by local standards. 2 stories, with 4 bedrooms, a living room separate from the dining room, a spacious kitchen with a wood stove, and another gas one, a modernization that impressed us enormously. And even an indoor bathroom with running water, a luxury we had never experienced. Each child will have their own room, announced Aunt Louise to the delight of Paul and Rosie, who had always shared tight spaces. Adapting to the new life wasn't simple. My father, accustomed to physical work in the fields, now had a job at a local store, attending the counter, making deliveries. His hands, once calloused from the hoe, now handled notebooks and calculated accounts. In the first few weeks, he would return home with a lost look, as if he didn't exactly know who he was in this new reality. As for me, I was enrolled in Our Lady of Grace School, run by nuns. It was a completely different environment from the rural school. Rooms separated by grade, several teachers, specific subjects, impeccable uniforms, strict rules. On the first day, looking at those dozens of girls in their pleated skirts and starched white blouses, I felt a fear that I hadn't experienced since the dark times in our old house. "You'll get used to it," assured Aunt Louise, adjusting my navy blue tie for the 3rd time. "It's one of the best schools in the region. A diploma from here opens doors." I said nothing, but doubted that I would ever get used to belonging to that world. The other girls came from established families in the town, daughters of merchants, the pharmacist, the notary, even the mayor. I was the girl from the countryside, with a heavy accent and rustic manners, wearing a second-hand uniform that Aunt Louise had obtained from an acquaintance. The first months were of almost total isolation. I always sat at the back of the room, spoke only when directly questioned by the nuns, avoided recess by staying in the library under the pretext of studying. It wasn't just shyness, it was a protective barrier that I had erected around myself, an invisible wall that kept the world at a safe distance. Academically, however, I flourished. I discovered in books a refuge, an alternative world where I could escape from the complications of reality. Sister Cecilia, the Portuguese teacher, was the first to notice my talent for writing and reading. "You have a gift with words," she told me one afternoon, after reading an essay I had written about the place I come from. I had described the undulating fields of our property, the clear water creek, the yellow ipe trees that exploded in color at the end of winter, with a vividness that surprised her. "You should consider being a teacher someday." It was the first time someone suggested that I could be more than a housewife, more than a continuation of my mother's destiny. The idea planted itself like a fragile seed in infertile ground, but which, against all odds, began to germinate. At home, our new family dynamic also found its own rhythm. Aunt Louise, although energetic and sometimes excessively practical, had a generous heart. She treated us as if we were her own children, with a peculiar mixture of discipline and affection that, to my surprise, worked well. "A girl your age needs to learn more than studying," she would say, teaching me to crochet on winter nights. "She needs to know how to manage a house, sew a button, make a cake that doesn't look like a brick. But she also needs to know mathematics so as not to be deceived in accounts, and read good books to have topics and her own opinion." It was a vision of femininity that was halfway between the traditional and the progressive for the time, especially in rural Georgia in the early 60s. Aunt Louise wasn't revolutionary. She didn't openly defend that women should have careers instead of families. But she firmly believed that an educated woman made better choices in life. My father, in turn, seemed to slowly rejuvenate. The weight he carried on his shoulders since my mother's death, aggravated by the incident with my grandfather, began to diminish. He started to smile more, to tell stories during dinner, to play with Rosie and help Paul with his studies. Occasionally, on Saturday nights, he even went to the movies with some colleagues from the store. A socialization that he would never have considered in our previous life. It was on one of these Saturday nights, when I was 15, that Aunt Louise and I had the conversation that would change my understanding of what had happened in our old house. We were just the two of us at home. My father had gone out with Paul to see a movie in the only movie theater in town. Rosie was at a birthday party of a little friend. Aunt Louise was crocheting while I read a book that Sister Cecilia had lent me. "Eleanor," she said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had established between us, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you for a long time." I raised my eyes from the book, noting the unusual seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Aunt?" She put the crochet aside and looked at me directly. "What really happened with your grandfather?" The question hit me like a bucket of cold water. In all those years, no one, absolutely no one, had asked this directly. It was a silently forbidden topic, a ghost that hovered in our family but was never named. I hesitated, feeling my throat suddenly dry. He slipped and hit his head on the stove. It was an accident. Aunt Louise continued looking at me, her penetrating eyes as if they could read through my rehearsed words. "Eleanor," she finally said, her voice softer, "I'm asking because I need to know if I'm right about what I suspected for so long. I'm not judging anyone. I just want to understand." "Understand what?" I asked defensively, although I knew exactly what she was talking about. "I began to suspect when I visited you," she continued, ignoring my question. "I saw how you would cringe when he approached, how your eyes, so similar to your mother's, had lost that child's light. It wasn't just mourning, it was something more. Something that I recognized because," she paused, breathing deeply, "because I went through something similar when I was your age. That unexpected confession broke something inside me. Tears that I had contained for years began to silently stream down my face. Nobody would believe," I whispered finally. "He was respected. I was just a girl. I would have believed," she responded simply. "That's why I got so close to you all after your mother passed. I saw the signs, but I wasn't sure. I couldn't interfere without proof. And then my father discovered," I completed, the words now coming out like a torrent that could no longer be contained. "He saw Grandpa trying to, and they fought, and Grandpa fell. And I couldn't finish." Aunt Louise rose from her armchair and came to sit beside me on the sofa, enveloping me in an embrace that was both protective and understanding. For the first time since it all happened, I allowed myself to truly cry. Not the silent sobs against the pillow at night, but an open, visceral crying that shook my entire body. "Your father did what needed to be done," she said when I finally calmed down. "Any father who respects himself would have done the same." "How did you know?" I asked, wiping the tears with the backs of my hands. "How were you sure?" "When you live long enough, certain things become clear," she answered enigmatically. Then, with a sigh, she added, "And your father told me, right after you moved here. He needed to confide in someone and decided to trust me." I remained silent, absorbing that information. So my father had spoken about the subject, just not with me. "Why are you telling me this now?" I finally asked. Aunt Louise held my hands between hers, her eyes meeting mine with a rare intensity. Because you've carried this burden for too long, Eleanor. Carried it in silence, thinking you need to protect your father, your siblings, even me. But secrets like this sicken the soul. They consume the person from inside, like rust on iron. Believe me. I know. She paused, as if deciding how far she should go. What happened in that house wasn't your fault, nor was it your father's fault. The only person to blame has already paid for what he did. And now it's time for you to start freeing yourself from this weight, so you can truly live. That conversation, although painful, was the first true step in my healing journey. It wasn't magical or instantaneous. The scars didn't disappear overnight. But something fundamental changed. I was no longer alone with my secret. There was someone who knew, who understood, who didn't judge me for the part I thought I had played in that nightmare. In the years that followed, I gradually found my voice. With Aunt Louise's guidance and the silent but constant support of my father, I began to rebuild myself, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Each nightmare faced, each memory processed, each new day fully lived was a victory against the past that tried to define me. The scars remained, of course, some visible only to me, others that affected relationships, choices, fears. But scars are also marks of healing, silent testimonies of battles won against adversities that could have destroyed us, but didn't succeed. And so it was, between pains and healings, falls and risings, that I reached adulthood, not intact, not perfect, but whole, and finally, mistress of my own destiny. The years unfolded like the pages of an old book, some chapters softer, others rougher, but all composing the story that brought me here, to my 78 years, sitting on this wooden porch in the same rural Georgia that saw me born. Time has whitened my hair, marked my face with wrinkles that tell stories without words, slightly curved my back, but it hasn't been able to bend my spirit. Not after all I've faced. The 1960s brought profound changes not just for me, but for the entire United States. While the country lived through its own political tumults, I was finishing my studies at the nuns' school in Fairview. Sister Cecilia, the one who first glimpsed in me a potential beyond the limitations of my origin, insisted that I take the exam for the normal school. "You have a vocation for teaching, Eleanor," she would tell me with that serene certainty that characterized her personality. "It would be a waste if you settled for less." I became an elementary school teacher in 1965 at 18 years old. My first job was at a rural school, not very different from the one where I began my own studies. The single room, the desks worn by use, the students with varying ages, everything brought me bittersweet memories of my own childhood. But now I was on the other side, in the position of one who guides, who protects. It was in that same year that my father married again to Louise, the one who had been our safe harbor in the most difficult moments. It wasn't a surprise to anyone. The two had developed a silent partnership over the years, a companionship that eventually blossomed into something deeper. Paul, then 16 years old, and Rosie, at 13, accepted the development naturally. For them, Aunt Louise had already been practically a mother for years. I remember the simple wedding in the main church of Fairview. My father, at 45 years old, seemed nervous like a teenager, constantly adjusting the borrowed suit that didn't fit well on his broad worker's shoulders. Louise, with a discreet light blue dress and a small flower arrangement in her graying hair, radiated a contained happiness, appropriate for a widow of her age. "Are you happy about this, aren't you, Ellie?" my father asked me on the eve of the ceremony, when we found ourselves alone on the porch of the house. "Of course I am, Dad," I answered sincerely. "You both deserve this chance." He nodded, relieved, and then said something that would forever be engraved in my memory. "You know, there are days I still wake up thinking about your mother. I think a part of me will always love her. But I learned that our heart can expand, can love again without betraying what it felt before." He paused, his eyes getting lost on the horizon where the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky red and gold. "I think it's like that with pain too, Ellie. It doesn't completely disappear, but we can learn to carry it without it destroying us." It was the closest conversation we had had about everything that happened years ago. Neither he nor I directly mentioned the events of that fateful night, but it wasn't necessary. There was an understanding between us that transcended words. The following year, I met Anthony. He was the new doctor in town, freshly graduated from Atlanta, idealistic and full of plans to improve the health of the rural population. Our first meeting was at the school where I taught. He had gone to vaccinate the children against polio, part of a national campaign. "Does the teacher also need to take the vaccine?" he joked when he saw me organizing the children in line. "I've already had all the necessary vaccines, doctor," I answered with a formality that was part of my armor against the world. "But thank you for your concern." In the following months, Anthony appeared with increasingly greater frequency at the school, always with some plausible medical excuse, checking the students' vision, distributing information about dental hygiene, giving lectures about worm prevention. But his eyes invariably sought me in the room, and his visits always extended with conversations after the end of the school day. Resisting him was my first instinctive reaction. The trauma of adolescence had erected walls around my heart, making me cautious with any male approach. The few friends I made over the years frequently teased me about my prolonged singleness, without really understanding the abyss of distrust that existed within me. "You can't spend your entire life alone, Eleanor," my colleague Helen, the science teacher, would say while we corrected tests together. "Dr. Anthony is a good catch, and he's clearly interested." "I'm fine like this," I would answer automatically. "I have my students, my family, my books. Not every woman needs a husband to feel complete." It was true, in part. I had built a meaningful life without depending on a romantic relationship. But there was also the fear, the deep and irrational fear that any intimacy could awaken the dormant demons of my past. It was Louise who, with her practical wisdom, finally opened a breach in my defenses. "I understand your fear, Eleanor," she told me one Sunday afternoon while we prepared lunch. "But not all men are like your grandfather. Your own father is proof of that. And if you continue running from the possibility of loving, you'll be allowing that man to continue controlling your life, even after death." Her words hit me with the force of a revelation. I was, in fact, letting the ghost of my grandfather dictate my limits, my possibilities. It was an insidious form of self-imposed prison. In the summer of 1967, I finally allowed Anthony to take me to dinner in Marietta, the larger nearby city. I was so nervous that I could barely eat the appetizers he ordered. "Relax," he smiled, noticing my discomfort. "It's just dinner. I'm not asking you to marry me, yet." That "yet" should have scared me, but strangely, it made me smile. There was something in Anthony's direct honesty that disarmed my defenses. Our courtship progressed slowly, with an almost reverential care on his part. He seemed to intuit, without my needing to explain, that there were wounds in me that needed time to completely heal. He never pressed for physical intimacy beyond what I was comfortable giving, never questioned my occasional, inexplicable withdrawals. One starry night, sitting by the pond on the outskirts of town, I made the most difficult and liberating decision of my life. I told him everything. About my mother, about my grandfather, about the night my father inadvertently became a killer to protect me. I spoke without looking at him directly, my eyes fixed on the dark waters that reflected the star-dotted sky. When I finished, there was a long silence. I feared having made an irreparable mistake, having destroyed any possibility of a future with him. Finally, I gathered courage to look at him. Silent tears were streaming down his face. "Eleanor," he finally said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for trusting me enough to share this. I can't imagine the courage it must have required, not only to survive that, but to become the extraordinary person you are today." He took my hands between his, in a gesture that was both protective and respectful. "Nothing you told me changes what I feel for you. If something changed, it was my admiration, which only increased." We married in 1968, in a simple ceremony in the same church where my father and Louise had sealed their union years before. It was an old-fashioned country wedding, with a celebration in the parish hall, food prepared by the women of the community, music played by a local band. The first years of our marriage were of mutual adaptation. Despite my conscious decision to trust Anthony, my body kept memories that my rational mind couldn't always control. There were nights when I woke up screaming, moments of panic seemingly without cause, disproportionate reactions to innocent gestures. Anthony, with the patience of someone who truly loves, was by my side in each relapse, in each progress. "We're not in a hurry," he used to say. "We have our whole life ahead of us." In 1970, our first child was born, a healthy boy we named Charles, in honor of my mother, Caroline. The birth was difficult, complicated by traumatic memories that transformed the physical experience into a psychological ordeal. But when they placed that small bundle in my arms, something deep transformed inside me. "I'll protect you," I whispered to the baby, who looked at me with wide blue eyes, so similar to mine. "Nothing and no one will hurt you as long as I live." It was a promise that echoed the one my own father had made to me, albeit belatedly. One circle closed, while another opened. 2 years later, our family was completed with the birth of Mary, a little girl with dark hair and an easy smile, who from the beginning showed the determination that would be her trademark throughout life. The 1970s passed quickly, between diapers, first steps, first words, occasional trips to Atlanta to visit Anthony's parents, sleepless nights with feverish children, everyday joys that gradually healed old wounds. I continued teaching, eventually assuming the position of principal at the same school where I began my career. In 1980, at 33 years old, I faced another significant loss. My father died of a massive heart attack while working in the small orchard he maintained in the backyard of the house in Fairview. He was found by Louise, fallen among the orange trees he cultivated with such care. He was only 60 years old. The funeral was a surreal experience. The same cemetery where, so many years before, we had buried my grandfather, now received my father. Two men as different as day and night, united only by the blood they shared, but not by values or character. As I watched the coffin descend into the earth, a storm was forming on the horizon, large black clouds rapidly advancing, bringing with them strong winds and the first heavy drops of rain. It was as if the sky itself was paying tribute to that simple man who had done what needed to be done to protect his daughter, carrying afterward the weight of that act for the rest of his life without ever complaining. "Even the weather came to say goodbye," commented Paul, my brother, now a 31-year-old man, married with 3 children. The rain completely poured down when the last handful of earth covered the coffin. We didn't run for shelter like many of those present did. We remained there, me, Paul, Rosie, Louise, Anthony, and my small children, letting the water wash our tears in an involuntary baptism that seemed appropriate for the moment. It was at that instant, soaked to the bone but strangely at peace, that I realized how much my faith had been fundamental in my journey. Not a dogmatic or ritualistic faith, but that deep confidence that, even in the most devastating storms of life, there exists a greater purpose that we don't always immediately understand. This faith didn't come from a dramatic epiphany or a sudden conversion. It was built slowly, through the small and great trials I faced. It grew on the nights when I, still a traumatized child, looked at the stars and felt a loving presence that transcended my comprehension. It strengthened when, against all odds, I found in Anthony not just a husband, but a partner who helped me rebuild the trust I thought I had lost forever. "God writes straight with crooked lines," Louise used to say. And although I didn't completely understand this statement in my youth, with time it gained deep meaning for me. How else to explain that an abused, traumatized, almost destroyed girl could not only survive, but flourish? How to justify that, despite everything? I had found love, formed a family, built a meaningful career. How to understand that the same hands that were wounded now could heal, teach, create? Throughout the years that followed, this faith sustained me through other trials. It was with me when my son Charles suffered a serious accident at 15 that almost left him paralyzed. It persisted when Mary, at 20, announced she was pregnant, and the boyfriend had disappeared upon learning of the news. It didn't abandon me even when, in 1995, Anthony was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer that would take him in less than a year. In the 6 months that I cared for him at home, watching that strong man waste away day by day, I questioned many times the reason for so much suffering. Why did someone so good have to depart so early, at 55 years old? Why, after all I had already faced, did I need to go through this trial too? I didn't find easy answers. Perhaps there aren't any. But I discovered that faith is not having all the answers. It's trusting, even when the questions remain open. On the night Anthony departed, I was alone with him in the room. My children had gone to fetch the priest, attending to their father's last request. I held his hand, already cold and weak, while he struggled for each difficult breath. "Don't be afraid," I whispered, repeating the same words that he had so many times said to me on the nights when nightmares tormented me. "I'm here with you." His eyes, clouded by morphine but still lucid, found mine. With a visible effort, he managed to articulate his last words. "You are the strongest person I've ever known." He departed serenely, as he had lived, and although the pain was almost unbearable, I also felt a strange peace, the certainty that our love didn't end there, that there was something more beyond this life that we cannot fully understand. The years that followed were of reconstruction, once again. I retired from teaching, but remained active in the community, working especially with women and children in vulnerable situations. Perhaps because I knew, better than many, how important it is to have someone who believes in you when the entire world seems to collapse. I had the joy of seeing my children grow and form their own families. Charles followed in his father's footsteps in medicine, specializing in pediatrics. Mary, after raising her daughter Sophia alone, graduated in law and today works defending victims of domestic violence and abuse, a choice that didn't surprise me, knowing her family history. My grandchildren, I have 5 of them, grew up hearing stories about the grandfather they didn't know, about great-grandmother Caroline who departed so early, about life in rural Georgia long ago. But I never told them about the darkest part of our family history. Some truths are too heavy to share with children, and perhaps it will never be necessary for them to know. Today, at 78 years old, I look back and see a winding path, with ups and downs, joys and pains, achievements and losses. I see a frightened girl who became a strong woman not despite what she suffered, but partly because of it, because each trial overcome, each storm weathered, taught me something about resilience, about forgiveness, about the human capacity to begin again. If I could speak to that 10-year-old girl who lost everything in a single day, I would tell her that the road will be difficult, but that she has within her a strength she doesn't yet know. I would tell her that the scars will never completely disappear, but that they can become marks of honor, testimonies of battles won. I would tell her above all that she is not alone, that there are good people in this world, ready to extend a hand when we most need it, and that God never abandons us, even when we don't understand His ways. This is my story, a story of pain, yes, but also of redemption. A story about how faith can sustain us in the most violent storms of life. A story that perhaps can bring hope to someone who, at this exact moment, is going through their own valley of shadows, questioning if they will ever see light again. If you're going through something similar, know that you're not alone, that the wounds that seem impossible to heal today can become part of your strength tomorrow, that you are stronger than you imagine, more loved than you can perceive, and that your story isn't over yet. And if my story touched your heart in any way, I ask that you share it with others who might need to hear this message of hope. Click the like button so more people can know this story and perhaps find courage for their own battles. Subscribe to the channel to follow other true accounts of overcoming and faith that are published on this channel daily. Because in the end, that's what saves us, knowing that we are not alone in our struggles, that others have walked through similar valleys and found their way back to the light. May God be with you, today and always.